My name is Russ Kilborn, in case you weren't sure, and I'm just going to give a brief introduction to Nandita's talk. And also, I need to say a couple of words about the sort of context here. Since Nandita doesn't have any technology, there's no PowerPoint announcing that this is brought to you by the PostHumanism Research Network or Institute. The PostHumanism Research Institute is based at Brock University, and it's sort of a physical thing that exists at Brock. And since then, more recently, we've founded something more virtual and more international, the PostHumanism Research Network, which exists both online and also in various places around the world, really. But it started between Brock and Laurier. We have people affiliated with us across the province, across Canada, and in Europe, and it's growing, right? So, just so you know. That leads, I guess, to the next question, which is what exactly do we mean by posthumanism? Posthumanism doesn't have a singular definition. It does depend on the person using it in the context and so forth. So I'll leave that for now and just move right into introducing Nandita, the speaker today. Dr. Nandita Biswas Mellamphy is Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science, affiliate member of the Department of Women's Studies and Feminist Research, and Director of the New Electoral Governance Group at Western University of London, and is a research fellow at the Center for Transformative Media at the New School in New York City, and the Center for War and Technology at Bath University in the UK. Dr. Biswas Mellamphy's research interests are situated at the intersections of political theory, continental philosophy, and media theory. Her publications include a book titled The Three Stigmata of Friedrich Nietzsche, Political Psychology, Physiology in the Age of Nihilism. Another book titled The Digital Dionysus, Nietzsche and the Network-Centric Condition, with Dan Mellamphy, who's here too. And the forthcoming book titled War on Terror and the Digital Dark Side. And so that's it for my introduction. I now will hand it over to Nandita.
Thank you. You can all hear me. I have a pretty loud voice, sometimes too loud. It's okay? Good. All right, and I just want to warn you, this talk is about 55 minutes, so short. So thank you so much to the newly formed PRN, PostHumanism Research Network, as well as PRI, PostHumanism Research Institute, for inviting me here today, especially to Russ Kilborn, Christine Daggett, and the entire executive committee. I've been a supporter of the PRI since its inception, and I'm very much looking forward to collaborations between the PRN and Western University's EGG Electoral Governance Group, a group that is only slightly older, maybe 3 to 4 years old, having been formed in September 2013 to critically and interdisciplinarily explore the many ways in which societies are harnessing the power of new information and communication technologies, as well as the ways in which societies are being harnessed and morphed by the increasing volume, velocity, and variety of digital information. So this is what I'm going to try to lay out in my talk today. First, I'll start off by introducing the idea of information and talking about what I see as the main challenges of the information age, especially as they relate to the rise of the big data paradigm. That is to say, the paradigm of massive scale data analytics that governs not only university research, but every other discipline and field of human endeavor today. What my friend and colleague, Patricia Clough, along with her excellent co-authors, Josh Scannell, Karen Gregory, and Ben Haber, have called the datalogical turn, in which humans and their everyday behaviors becomes, as they say, data type. Now, the term data, of course, is not new. Scientific and social scientific research has been data-driven for the better part of 6 decades now, especially since the integration of computer and computational systems into the research process. What is new, however, is that data is no longer viewed simply as signal parsed from noise, that is, as raw data that has to be cleaned, or that has been cleaned. As Clough and company note, the real allure of big data is not found in its representational content, that is, in its ability to, quote, describe a stabilized system or to follow a representational trail, but instead to collect information that would typically be discarded as noise. Indeed, it is those data that are most typically bracketed out as noise, that is, affect, or the dynamism of non-conscious or even non-human capacity, that are central to the datalogical turn, unquote. This, it seems to me, is an important point to keep in mind, because it will be key to understanding how and why increasing digital connectivity is quickly phasing human decision-making and intervention out of the datalogical loop, thereby establishing data hegemony in all realms of life. This is what I'm going to call post-human governance. And I think we're going to see this tendency toward replacing human-centered command systems with algorithmic command more and more. This is already happening in robotics research with the development of ever faster and more efficient unmanned weapon systems driven by ever more adaptive algorithms in combination with artificial intelligence networks. In fact, the schema I'm going to present, the one I developed in my own research, initially comes from robotics, which offers 3 categories of weapons based on the ability of autonomous machines to operate without human intervention. Humans-in-the-loop weapons are robots that can select targets and deliver force only with a human command. Humans-on-the-loop weapons are robots that can select targets and deliver force under the oversight of a human operator who can override the robot's actions. And human out-of-the-loop weapons are robots that are capable of selecting targets and delivering force without any human input or interaction. And if you think this is science fiction, you'd be wrong, because it's projected that by 2030, machine capabilities will have increased to the point that humans will not only become the weakest component in a wide array of systems and processes, but they will fade out of the decision-making loop entirely. Fully autonomous, unmanned lethal weapons, or killer robots as they're called, will be making combat decisions and acting with legal and policy constraints without requiring human input. What I'm doing here, and as I've done elsewhere, is to borrow this terminology and attempt to broach the concept of the post-human in terms of these 3 circuits of politics, as I call them. The politics of humans in the loop, the model in which the human is in command of animals and machines through free will. This is the humanistic view par excellence, in which the human, in the role of sovereign, is in command of all others, including animals and machine entities, and even of the divine, insofar as the king was representative of the earth, of the divine on earth. Next, the politics of humans on the loop, the model in which humans share command and co-evolve with other animals and machine entities. Here, for example, we could think of Nietzsche's emphasis on revaluing human life as part of physis, or the impersonal forces of natural growth and decay. We could also think of Donna Haraway's notion of the cyborg, or Rosie Brodotti's notion of Zoe-centered egalitarianism, Zoe meaning living beings. What's interesting to note here is that this politics still sees a central role for human command, and thus retains vestiges of the human-in-the-loop model. But it's really the last one, the politics of humans out of the loop, that is the focus here, because it's where you see the post-human take command and replace human-based control and command. This, I argue, is the real realm of the post-human. Here, it is the computational power of machines and machine learning that is most significant, especially the forces of mathematical algorithms and networked forms of intelligence, for example, artificial neural networks, that have the power to reorder human activity. So faced with these 3 circuits of politics, I'm arguing that what we're seeing today is the gradual phasing out of the human-in-the-loop model of governance, and its replacement with what I'm going to call post-human governance, that is to say, the replacement of human-centered command and governance of populations by way of biological rationales with technical or informatic governance, governance by informatic command and data hegemony, in which human-centered command is taken completely out of the loop of decision-making. As Michel Foucault has already shown in his conception of panopticism, the genealogy of power is largely a story about the development of power's automaticity. That is to say, power's ability to become automatic and autonomous, power's capacity to govern humans by exploiting its machinic properties. Hence, Foucault writes in Discipline and Punish, the major effect of the panopticon is to induce in the inmate a state of conscious and permanent visibility that assures the automatic functioning of power. To arrange things so that the surveillance is permanent in its effects, even if it is discontinuous in its action, that the perfection of power should tend to render its actual exercise unnecessary, that this architectural apparatus should be a machine for creating and sustaining a power relation independent of the person who exercises it. It is an important mechanism, for it automatizes and disindividualizes power. Power has its principle not so much in a person as in a certain concerted distribution of bodies, surfaces, lights, gazes, in an arrangement, the internal mechanisms of which produce the relation in which individuals are caught up. And that's from Foucault. Power, both disciplinary power as well as biopower, governs humans by exploiting its own post-human machinic tendencies. The machinic helps the economic converge with the technological and the social. Machines advance economic rationality through technological innovation by cutting the costs of human labor by way of non-human decision-making mechanisms. So, following this important Foucauldian point, I'm suggesting that what we're seeing today is a continuation of the development of power's automaticity, its growing reliance on machinic command, and its shedding reliance on human agency. What I want to make clear here is that by post-human, then, I don't mean a post-human subject. I am not, in other words, conceptualizing in terms of subjectivity as hybrid or post-human subjects. That kind of interpretation is more consistent, I think, with the human on-the-loop category. By post-human, I refer instead to a systemic tendency, namely the datalogical tendency toward phasing out the human in decision-making and replacing it with machine-driven algorithmic command that requires no human intervention. And this post-human tendency is occurring in all realms of life, from military, scientific, and economic to commercial, social, and cultural. The post-human, as I understand it then, is not a merging of the human with the machine, but rather a retranslation of the human into machine language. Algorithms reduce human expression and action to machine-readable form, and in this sense, the human becomes both post-humanized and machinified, as well as pre-humanized and animalized by the myriad effects of this global process of human adaptation and acculturation to algorithmic logic. As Dan Mellamphy and I argued in a 2015 special issue of Fiber Culture, the concept of information itself has no single unified definition, even though there are various theories that have been put forward to conceptualize it. Initially, as a communication process based on signal-noise transmission, or feedback and/or stimulus-response circuits. More and more, however, information is being conceptualized as data, or something akin to a commodity come object that can be possessed, indeed purchased, traded, and legislated. The past decade has witnessed rather remarkable convergences in the globalization of political military surveillance, surveillance-driven capitalism, and big data-driven scientific investigation, all of which hinge on the accumulation, processing, and management of this ill-defined concept of information. So when sociologists of communication, for example, speak about information, they usually mean the term in a semantic or linguistic sense. But when computer or data scientists speak about information, they mean it strictly in the mathematical sense, as definable quantum or quantity. So that's something significant to note. We're not all talking about the same thing when we say information. Nonetheless, this definitional ambiguity seems to have strengthened rather than weakened the forces of what I'm calling data hegemony, largely because what is driving this tendency is not the question of what is information, but rather the question of what can information in the form of data do? The answer is, it sheds light on and connects phenomena that are otherwise inaccessible to human calculation and apprehension. And keeping to this notion of shedding light on things, the presumption is that information that is algorithmically parsed can in fact enlighten human beings. Algorithmic enlightenment is being promoted as a new technical paradigm for social and political governance based on online, digitally interconnected services that directly respond to user-generated data. Champions of algorithmic enlightenment promise to free humans from the foibles of traditional and hierarchical forms of power. They say that algorithms are not just tools that help us find information, but that they also provide a means to participate in social and political discourse, as well as identify ourselves within those publics in which we wish to participate. Figures such as Tim O'Reilly and organizations such as Code for America argue that the real-time feedback algorithms used by corporations like Google and Facebook can be used by governments and politicians to solve societal problems by means other than political. And yet, the promise of more transparency turns out to really mean more disclosure of data in machine-readable form. Information and data sciences, or simply big data as it's called today, promises to reveal patterns of regularity in empirical data, thus imbuing data with seemingly predictive power. From politics and warfare to commerce and social media, it is the prominent paradigm, it's the dominant paradigm of big data that is directing the course of planetary futurity. As many have noted, data science is not just a method or a set of methods, but a frame that is reorganizing how knowledge is being perceived, generated, and categorized, and how circuits of power are being reconfigured and renormalized. For champions of the big data paradigm, this transformation is a great thing that's going to make everything easier, better, and probably a lot more fun too. Opening the consumer or user or researcher up to a world of new data-driven products and practices, a flood of data, or dataclism, as the founder of OkCupid calls it in his book of the same name. For these starry-eyed advocates, or what we could call data utopians, the convergence between the torrents of data and the procedures of computation that can transform it into lucrative and legitimate actions in the world holds the key to the past, present, and future. For these types, the promise of big data will be accomplished through the capacities of machines to learn using algorithms that yield highly valuable predictions without human intervention, and thus ostensibly free human societies from the weaknesses of human bias, and yet still work in service of human beings and their interests. This is generally the kind of view that began with the digital utopian vision created by Silicon Valley ideology, also known as the Californian ideology, that combined the, quote, freewheeling spirit of the hippies and the entrepreneurial zeal of the yuppies, unquote. The vision of governance by digital technologies and information feedback networks was really the digital utopia dreamt of by the early pioneers of Silicon Valley, and was encapsulated in the California ideology, which was a combination of libertarianism and techno-fetishism, focusing entirely on the emancipatory potential of computers, computation, and digital technologies. The argument was that government had become ineffective, and the old-fashioned type of politics had failed. Silicon Valley, not politicians, should take over the job of governing nations because they could do it more cheaply and effectively. I mean, who needs laws when you have sensors and information feedback mechanisms, right? This ideology and idealization is still, of course, rampant, if not ramped up, everywhere. In the words of Silicon Morpheus, you can see it when you look out your window and or use Windows, Apple, Android, etc., or when you turn on your television or screen interface. You can feel it when you go to your work, your church, when you pay your taxes, unquote. The ever-presence of code and the emancipatory potential of code, be it archist or anarchist, is part and parcel of this worldview. Within it, whether archist or anarchist, the digital code is the crux and the key to solving all problems, including problems of poverty, social, economic, political inequality, and injustice. With an eye to post-human governance, however, this data utopianism is revealed to be utterly illusory, if not also duplicitous, the dominant digital duplicity, in fact. It is itself only a part of an overall strategy or grand politics, if you will, of planetary regulation at and on a machinic scale, at the level of the machine and not the human. While it's true that the internet, mobile devices, and social networking apps have been used to create popular revolutions against governments perceived as unjust, to mobilize huge swaths of populations, and to enable large-scale acts of popular protest, these very same technologies are first and foremost corporate tools, and moreover monitored, never mind monetized networks. Networks that are themselves used as nets to gather, go through, and govern. That is, lead, steer, direct, communicative, qua missive info. Missive information, always being in this network of relays and redirection, fundamentally misinformation. Such platforms are consequently rather perfect for the spreading of so-called viral narratives in all their fragmentary forms. All of them, no matter how activist, being at base, that is basically, reactionary. These are engines that are perfectly primed, as they say, for reactionary ideas that typically awaken and inflame historical, that is culturally and subculturally rooted, and histrionic, that is present tense, high ground, high drama hatreds. Those base and basic go-to or scapegoat mechanisms inherent to the social mechanics, social structure of the human animal/animus. In consequence, the structure and dynamics of these platforms foster enormous upsurges of popular sentiment, which are difficult to foresee or to regulate, never mind legislate. Ironically, while the new media and information communication technologies in widespread use, such as Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, give users the feeling that they are not passive consumers, but active creators of information, the new information ecosystem is highly predatory and tends to exploit vulnerabilities and to reinforce rather than challenge opinions, biases, and beliefs. Messages, as I've said, can be easily and directly circulated, modified, and amplified without the need for any centralized authority or adjudicating body. And for these reasons, digital communications and new media have become key weapons of larval warfare, both for extremist, fundamentalist, and revolutionary groups, as well as for governments who argue that the needs of national security trump the demands of individual civil liberty. Increasingly, as everyone knows or should know, in the information age, humans are being analyzed, managed, and exploited bio-informatically. That is, not just in terms of the physical and mental labor generated by their biological bodies, but also in terms of their digital or virtual informatical bodies. With the rise of biometric technologies, identity in large part has come to consist in the various digitized data artifacts that make up what is now known as data bodies. Data bodies are virtual assemblages made up of the digital and analog information connected to an individual, group, or network. The individual fleshy body in its physical presence is itself but one aspect or facade of more complex networks of information. Information, in the form of data, has become the most important societal resource, and societal infrastructures and norms are being re-engineered to privilege activities that generate continuous digital information flows. Those activities that do not generate data are downplayed, deprivileged, eventually defunct, because soon there will be little to no part of life that will not be digitized, and thus subject to computational protocols and digital interfaces. Today, more and more, the flesh and bone body is being eclipsed by the data body. More and more often, it is the data body that is taking precedence. And since not only individuals but collectives have data bodies, these databases tend to be more revealing and far more useful for political purposes. The virtual quality of data bodies allows the rules and norms of a society to be circumvented, since most laws apply to the physical individual rather than to cyber bodies. While existing laws most often limit coercion or exploitation of the physical body, lawmakers and legal theorists worldwide are currently scrambling to create and develop adequate laws to govern human activities in cyberspace and indeed in cyber time. Governments and corporations trawl the data bodies attached to individuals and collectivities in cyberspace and against cyber time in order to track and monetize the information about user and consumer preferences gleaned from social media sites such as Facebook. In the search for potential terrorists, for example, nations are harnessing similar digital tools and algorithms that scan and filter the vast amounts of consumer digital data in order to identify patterns of suspicious behavior. Although the effects of power are still experienced by real flesh and bone individuals, data bodies are becoming rapidly part of basic infrastructure of informationalized societies, in which public deliberation and democratic processes are bypassed in favor of corporate data mining techniques and predictive analyses of big data. While the classic liberal definition of political power maintains that the individual holds a basic, inalienable right to be free from subjection to another's will, this definition assumes the central role of the physical body as the repository of universal right. The virtual body is not subject to such political regulation and can be appropriated and manipulated far more easily. The data body, as such, is a deeply problematic construct from the perspective of political theories that focus on the physical individual. The individual citizen invested with intentionality or agency, as well as political rights and duties, is quickly fading as the central model in favor of a corporatized marketing model of the data body that can be used to informatically exploit and direct consumer behaviors, both overtly and covertly, for the purpose of commercial and/or political profits. Rather than a biological organism, the basic unit of the big data paradigm is not the individual, as it were, but a dividual, a series of mutable data points that can be sliced, parsed, sequenced, and algorithmically recombined. The data body is thus an algorithmic body, a recombinable body in machine-readable format. Globalization extends further by way of the expansion and adoption of digital information and communication technologies that make it easier for human beings to become connected beyond physical boundaries and national borders. Right now, the development of globe-girdling networks of information are underway at a rate and scale that has never been seen before in human history. That means that everything that we do will be generating data that can be mined and monetized. This is an emergent logic of accumulation in the network sphere, and what Shoshana Zuboff is calling a surveillance capitalism, which she describes as constituted by often opaque mechanisms of extraction, of commodification, and of control that alienate people from their own bodies and behaviors, all the while generating new markets of prediction and speculation. Quote, Surveillance capitalism challenges democratic norms and departs in key ways from the centuries-long evolution of market capitalism, unquote. The question for us, however, is how to reconceptualize democracy and democratic norms in the context of what I have here called the politics of the humans out of the loop. This sets up a scenario in which you can start to question how information is colonizing us. In fact, humans are literally coming to be thought of as raw material or geological strata, as geologies or ecologies to be mined and exploited for valuable resources. A recent article from The Guardian, for example, announced that, quote, Silicon Valley siphons our data like oil, but the deepest drilling has just begun. Personal data is to the tech world what oil is to the fossil fuel industry. That's why companies like Amazon and Facebook plan to dig deeper than we ever imagined, end quote. Referring to Amazon's recent acquisition of the grocery chain Whole Foods, this article goes on to describe Silicon Valley as an extractive industry. Its resource isn't oil or copper, but data. Companies harvest this data by observing as much of our online activity as they can. By pairing them with those of millions of others, companies can discover patterns that help determine what kind of person you are and what kind of things you might buy. These patterns are highly profitable. Silicon Valley uses them to sell you products or sell you to advertisers. But feeding the algorithms that produce these patterns requires a steady stream of data. And while that data is certainly abundant, it's not infinite. Most of the data that lies closest to the surface is already claimed. Together, Facebook and Google receive a staggering 76% of online advertising revenue in the United States alone. To increase profits, Silicon Valley must extract more data. One method is to promote data gluttony, to get people to spend more time online, build new apps, and make them as addictive as possible. Another is to get more people online. This is the motivation for Facebook's Free Basics program, which provides a limited set of internet services for free in underdeveloped regions across the globe, in the hopes of harvesting data from the world's poorest. Of course, that's not what Mark Zuckerberg tells you. Instead, he declared that, quote, connectivity is a human right, and claimed that offering free basics was about connecting people in order to lift them out of poverty, to create jobs and educational opportunities. So when Facebook offered free basics to India last year, much to Zuckerberg's surprise, the Indian government banned it, arguing that Facebook's so-called free service violates the principle of net neutrality, since free basics would only give users access to a very limited and specifically Western, namely American, corporate content. Free basics, they concluded, would not serve the linguistic and cultural needs of India's population. Net activists, especially from the global south, called Facebook's program a form of digital colonialism. But in this case, it's not just that the world's poorest populations and their bodily labor are being subject to gross exploitation in disciplinary environments such as factories and sweatshops. The data bodies produced by these fleshy bodies are also subject to exploitation, because the data generated by more than 1 billion people would no doubt open up worlds of new revenue possibilities for Facebook and other tech companies. Surveillance capitalism meets neocolonialism. And that's part of Amazon's underlying rationale for buying Whole Foods, to have access to more and more data bodies and more monetizable information to exploit, making the rich even richer and the poor even poorer. Amazon, a pioneer in data mining and corporate surveillance in virtual environments, is going to show the world how to install these processes in physical environments as well. As one commentator put it, Amazon isn't abandoning online retail for brick and mortar. Rather, they're planning to fuse the two. It's going to digitize our daily lives in ways that make surge pricing your groceries look primitive by comparison. It's going to expand Silicon Valley's surveillance-based business model into physical space and make money from monitoring everything we do. And as the trend towards smartification continues, with ubiquitous and ambient computing, for example, the Internet of Things and smart cities, the complete integration of physical and virtual environments will mean that every aspect of the environment, including the body, becomes potentially data-rich and ready to be tapped, even fracked, which is a term used to describe the process of hydraulic fracturing, used in extracting oil, which causes earthquakes and other environmental hazards. It might be worth considering the analogy more seriously and to wonder how we have become subject to fracking, in this case, info-fracking. So not only are humans colonizing each other by way of technologies and information, but in the empire of the digital, all humans are being colonized by algorithmic mediation as the digital takes hold over the planet and in every sphere of knowledge. Today, people are subject not just to biopolitical exploitation based on geopolitical interests, but also to informatic exploitation in which, as Alex Galloway and Eugene Thacker have explained, in order to survive, humans are, quote, expected to give up not just their body's labor power, but also their body's information. And everything from biometric examinations at work, to the culling of consumer buying habits, to prospecting inside ethnic groups for disease-resistant genes. The biomass, not social relations, is today's site of exploitation, end quote. Whereas the term Anthropocene is a geological term referring to the impact of human activity on planetary ecology, in the scenario I'm presenting here, the Anthropocene becomes a platform of and for what Dan Mellamphy and I have called the Electrocene, a term that refers to the impact of electronic and computational activity upon anthropoi, or humans, human animals. The Electrocene emerges in tandem with the human propensity to adopt and indeed become addicted to technical devices that open onto a machine future. A future that is already here, albeit unevenly distributed, in the words of William Gibson. From this perspective, the acts we use so ubiquitously, these seemingly innocuous and wonderful useful apparati that do our bidding, are in fact traps within an overall overarching predatory economy of information extraction. Traps that lure human beings through addictive digital pharmatechnics. It is precisely by way of anthropocentricity, our propensity to be human-centered, that the Electrocene and its extractive capacities emerges, establishes, and entrenches itself. As Evgeny Morozov has written, quote, "The car is emblematic of transformations in many other domains, from smart environments for ambient assisted living, where carpets and walls detect that someone has fallen, to various master plans for the smart city, where municipal services dispatch resources only to those areas that need them. Thanks to sensors and internet connectivity, the most banal everyday objects have acquired tremendous power to regulate behavior. In the near future, Google will be the middleman standing between you and your fridge, you and your car, you and your rubbish bin, allowing the National Security Agency to satisfy its data addiction in bulk and via a single window," unquote. And for those such as Morozov, the rise of data and its technocratic logic have in fact entailed the death of politics, which is the very title of the piece to which I'm referring, an article that he wrote for The Guardian. For data dystopians, like Morozov, the data utopianism characteristic of Silicon Valley, in which all problems, even political, moral, and social ones, are to be dealt with via apps, sensors, algorithmic feedback, and digital devices, is nothing but a kind of technological solutionism that inverts causes and effects. As Morozov notes, intelligence agency had embraced solutionism even before governmental agencies, especially with respect to problems such as terrorism. So instead of thinking of terrorism politically, by looking for the root causes of terrorism in history and foreign policy, intelligence agencies embraced solutionism and turned terrorism into an informational problem, the solution to which was total information awareness, which sought to urge citizens to accept that instability is part of the game, that its root causes are neither traceable nor irreparable, and that the threat can only be preempted by out-innovating and out-surveilling the enemy with better and more communications. Rather than look for the proverbial needle in the haystack, the NSA's approach post 9/11 has been to collect the whole haystack. To quote then NSA Director Keith Alexander, why can't we collect all the signals all the time? Which entails the acquisition of as much information as possible and the maintenance of control over that information for as long as possible. Giorgio Agamben has noted that this inversion of attention from causes to effects has enabled the proliferation of control into every sphere of life. Quote, if government aims for the effects and not the causes, it will be obliged to extend and multiply control. Causes demand to be known, while effects can only be checked and controlled. Unquote. Agamben calls this, following Gilles Deleuze's comments on control and societies of control, l'état de contrôle, the control state. Here, we should understand state as both the political entity called the state, as well as state as a general condition for what I want to call data hegemony. Big data-driven solutionism, within the context of the electrocene, is, I would argue, a cloak for data hegemony. That is, the replacement of human-centered command systems with machinic, algorithmically driven command. Now, I suppose I should just point out here that there are many ways of conceptualizing the term hegemony, but I actually refer back to a pre-modern sense of the term hegemonikon, which comes from Stoicism, which simply means the master part, commanding faculty, or governing principle of the soul, and can be linked to an important term used by Plato, kybernetes, meaning governor or steersman. This idea of commanding or governing principle became the seed idea for Norbert Wiener's conception of cybernetics, having borrowed the term directly from Plato, which extended the commanding principle to animals, including humans, and machines. Cybernetics, according to Wiener, who got the idea from Plato, is the science of governance, namely the ability of a closed system to maintain its stability by constantly learning and adapting itself to changing circumstances. Algorithmic regulation shares the wet dream of cybernetics, the science of governance, by way of data hegemony, the condition in which data and the datalogical are in command of decision-making processes, a command that in a bygone era was occupied by the human. For data utopians, as Morozov notes, this is no trivial departure from how the usual technical systems, with their rigid if-then rules, operate. Suddenly, there's no need to develop procedures for governing every contingency, or so one hopes, for algorithms and real-time, immediate feedback can do a better job than inflexible rules out of touch with reality. But for data dystopians, myself included, this cybernetic efficiency is the replacement of human by post-human governance, a way of undermining the human by overmining them informatically. As the cultural theorist Jean Baudrillard foresaw back in 1992, quote, "We are at the critical limit where all effects can be reversed and communication vanishes into an excess of communication. Today, oppression occurs not primarily by way of coercion, force, and repression of political power, that is, through the deprivation of information and communication, but rather through the excesses of information and by way of the obligation to be more and more connected, more and more closely tied to the screen in restless circularity and autoreferentiality as integrated network." Unquote. Eventually, we will all be drowned in data, as Edward Snowden warned. The post-human by way of the utopianism of this dystopian electrocene and the computational powers of data hegemony, is advanced as a prosthesis or extension of the human, and yet it displaces the seat of agency from human to machinic agents, which, or who, in turn, avail themselves of humans, human habits, and human habitats. It is thus humans who turn out to be prostheses of machines. The implication is that the colonizing tendencies of this paradigm cannot simply be contained or resisted once and for all by political legislation or legal limits such as data privacy and data protection, because the computational power of this paradigm has already transformed concepts and practices of privacy and protection. As Snowden eerily declared in his 2013 Christmas address, a child born today will grow up with no conception of privacy at all. They'll never know what it means to have a private moment to themselves, an unrecorded, unanalyzed thought. So let me conclude on this chilling note then with a question. How to respond to power's exploitation of its post-human, that is, machinic propensities? Are we doomed simply to repeat the genealogy of viciousness, of the vicious circuits of power that are clearly phasing out the human element in all things? Can we salvage an old but perhaps appealing view of politics? Or should we rethink politics and salvage some aspect of it? Or is it necessary to think beyond politics in light of post-human governance? For example, should we be thinking about extending rights to machines, as science fiction author Charlie Strauss suggests in Accelerando? These are all good questions about which we should think very deeply and comprehensively. What I do know is that we need to start thinking of politics in terms of what I've here described as power's propensity to transform itself by way of non-human, or more precisely, machinic automaticity. Politics is nothing other than the process of power's exploitation of automatic machinic agencies for the purposes of governing humans, especially by exploiting the machinic element within humans. What kind of politics can be mobilized in the context of a planetary future in which humans are no longer in the loop? How to conceive of a politics in which humans are no longer in the loop? And can it be called a politics at all? Or rather, is it a kind of grand politics, as Nietzsche once suggested, or something altogether beyond politics? If politics is no longer the concept that provides the check and balance to human vicissitudes, then we must either think in terms of post-human politics, the politics of humans out of the loop, or at least be able to conceive of politics as something that's not necessarily grounded in assumptions about human beings being in the loop. My hunch is that what is needed is not simply a return to an old view of human politics, but a new vision of post-human politics. A politics in which humans can exploit their own out-of-the-loopness in order to re-engineer struggles for power.